Erev Shabbat Shalom Rabotai. We are continuing with our Mishna Yomi, Masechet Eruvin. We are up to Perik Chet Mishna Zayin. Today's Mishnayot should be Le'ilun Nishmat Neria ben Svetlana Ranbayev Neliyahu ben Burcha Yisraelov Menuchatam Began Eden. Amen. Yesterday's Mishnah, which discussed a water cistern shared by two courtyards, presented a dispute as to whether the wall that passes over the cistern legally divides the water between the two courtyards. We discussed that in yesterday's Mishnah. Today's Mishnah applies the same dispute to another water source, this one inside a single courtyard. Amata maim shi overet bechatzer. If a water canal coming from a river passes through a courtyard, and the courtyard wall runs over the top of the canal, which thereby encloses part of it within the courtyard. Now, before we continue, the commentaries explain it was common to dig canals next to a river to bring water to places farther away from the river. Now, in this case, the canal flowed from the river into a courtyard under its wall and then flowed back out to the river. So the Mishnah speaks of a canal that is at least 10 tefachim deep and 4 tefachim wide. Now, these dimensions make it an independent domain and not part of the courtyard. Since the canal is completely open at its ends to the river, which the Gemara Masechet Shabbat, page 6a says is considered a karmelit, the canal itself is treated as a karmelit as well. Now, a canal of smaller dimensions, however, would not be considered a domain of its own inside the courtyard. But again, that's why our Mishnah is speaking of a case where it is at least 10 tefachim deep and 4 tefachim wide. Now, the Mishnah says, "En mimal'in heimena b'Shabbat." We may not draw water from the canal on Shabbat, ele im ken asu lah mechitza gevoah 10 tefachim, unless they made a partition within the canal itself that is 10 tefachim high to separate the section of the canal in the courtyard from the part outside of it. Now, the Rav explains that this partition, this wall, must be placed within the banks of the canal and extend across its width so that people will see the partition as a separation between the water inside the courtyard and the water outside of it. Now, although the courtyard wall passes over the canal and therefore technically separates the part of the canal inside the courtyard from the outside, that wall does not look as if it's doing so since it was not built for that purpose. Now, since the rules for a wall, for partitioning a canal, are the same as those for dividing a cistern, which was that pool of water, the question of how much of the partition must be submerged in the water is subject to the machloket that we brought in yesterday's Mishnah, which is why we're discussing it now. And the Mishnah continues, Baknisa ba'itziah. They must make this partition both at the canal's entrance to the courtyard and at its exit from it. The canal itself must be clearly enclosed within the borders of the courtyard. And the Rav explains if only one side of the canal is partitioned, the canal is still a karmelit since it is entirely open at the other end to the area outside the courtyard. So they have to make this partition both at the entrance, the canal's entrance to the courtyard, and at its exit from it. Rabbi Yehuda says, Kotel she'al gabat tidon mishum mechitza. The courtyard wall that passes over the canal may be considered a valid partition even though it was not built specifically to separate the canal water. And the Rav explains Rabbi Yehuda is consistent with his view in yesterday's Mishnah that a suspended partition is valid even if it was not made specifically to partition the water beneath it, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yehuda, water may be drawn from the canal without placing new partitions within the canal. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Yehuda says he cites an incident to support his position. Maaseh be'ama shel Avel. It happened with the canal that flowed through the courtyards of the town of Avel. Shayu mimal'in mimena al pi zkenim b'Shabbat, that they would draw water from it on Shabbat by authorities of the elders, even though the canal had no partitions within it. So we see from this event that the elders accepted Rabbi Yehuda's position that water may be drawn from a canal that has no partitions within it. Amru lo, the rabbis told Rabbi Yehuda in response, Mipnei shelo haya ba kashiur. That incident is not a proof because the canal in that town did not have the minimum dimensions to qualify as an independent domain, which means it was either less than 10 tefachim deep or less than 4 tefachim wide. Now, lacking the dimensions to qualify as a domain on its own, the canal is automatically considered part of the larger private domain that it's in. Therefore, it does not become a Carmelite, even though it's open to the Carmelite outside, and therefore the courtyard's wall permitted just as they permit the rest of the courtyard. So they tell Rabbi Yehuda, your story is not a proof. And the Rav does say, Ven halacha kimoto, the halacha does not follow the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. And that is the end of Mishnah Zayin. Mishnah Chet now speaks of a balcony that is above a river. The people living in the house that opens to the balcony would draw water from the river through a hole in the balcony floor. The Mishnah explains how this may be done on Shabbat. And again, whoever can see the diagrams brought down, the Art School elucidated diagram A, B, and C we're going to refer to, or any other illustrated Mishnah, will be able to understand this Mishnah. If a balcony extends over a body of water, such as a river, and we may not draw water from the river to the balcony on Shabbat, because the river is a Carmelite and the balcony is a private domain. And the Tosfot on page 86b explained the balcony is attached to a wall in front of a window or door. Since the people inside the house have access to the balcony, it is an extension of the house, what we call Chorei Reshut HaYachid, and therefore even if the balcony itself is not enclosed with partitions, it has the law of a Reshut HaYachid like the house itself. And the Mishnah continues, and we may not draw water from the river to the balcony on Shabbat, that unless it would be forbidden unless they made partitions that are 10 tefachim high around the balcony or around the hole in its floor. Ben milmala, ben milmata. These partitions are valid whether they are above the balcony or beneath it. Now, partitions that are above are attached to the top of the balcony floor and extend 10 tefachim upward. Now, partitions that are below are attached to the underside of the balcony and extend 10 tefachim downward, which would be diagram A for the first case of extending 10 tefachim upwards, and diagram B, which would be 10 tefachim downwards. Now, either way, we view the partitions as extending downward into the river, converting that part of the river into a private domain. And the Rav says this is based on the principle known as Gud Achit, extend and lower the partition beyond where it actually ends. Now, the area enclosed by the partitions, either the balcony or the hole, must measure at least 4 tefachim by 4 tefachim, which is the minimum dimensions of a Reshut HaYachid, as the Rav tells us. Since both the balcony and the part of the river directly beneath it are private domains, one may draw water on Shabbat from the river to the balcony through the hole in the balcony floor. Now, in the following case, the Mishnah is going to bring, there are 2 balconies, one above the other, and each belongs to a different private domain. Similarly, if 2 balconies, one above the other, extend over a body of water and the holes in their floors line up, which the commentators explain, the hole in the upper balcony is directly above the hole in the lower balcony, so that when a bucket is taken from the river to the upper balcony or vice versa, it passes through the lower balcony. The law is as follows: Asu la elyona velo asu la tachtona. If the residents of both floors made partitions for the upper balcony, but they did not make partitions for the lower balcony, which the Rav explains is to avoid the expense of building 2 sets of partitions. The residents of both floors shared the costs of building the partitions around the upper balcony, with the understanding that the residents of the lower floor would have the right to use the upper balcony for drawing their water. The Mishnah says, Shten asurot ad she'arvu, they are all prohibited from drawing water unless they made an eruvei chatzerot. If no eruv was made, the residents of the upper floor may not draw water from the river, because the residents of the lower floor had acquired rights in the upper balcony by helping to build the partitions around it, and therefore the upper balcony is like a jointly owned courtyard from which carrying is forbidden into the privately owned upper floor. Now, since the residents of more than one private domain have rights to the upper balcony, it's like a courtyard in relation to the upper floor. Therefore, it's forbidden to take water from the upper balcony to the upper floor without en eruve chatzerot. If, however, the residents of the lower floor had not contributed to the walls of the upper balcony, they would have no rights there, and the residents of the upper floor would be allowed to draw water from the river to their balcony without en eruv. However, that's not the case. We know that the lower floor residents did chip in, and therefore you need an eruv. Now, as for the residents of the lower floor, they may not draw water to their balcony at all, even if there is an eruv, because there is no partition around their balcony, and so drawing water would be carried from a karmelit into a private domain. Now, the lower balcony, even without the walls, is a reshut yachid, because it opens to the window or door of a house, like we explained earlier. The river is a karmelit. Therefore, when water is drawn from the river to the balcony, it's being transferred from a karmelit to a reshut yachid. Now, the opposite applies in the reverse situation, where partitions were built only around the lower balcony. In that case, the residents of the lower floor would be forbidden to bring water from their balcony into their house unless an eruv is made, because their balcony is shared with the residents of the upper floor, making it like a courtyard, and the residents of the upper floor would be forbidden to draw water from the river to their balcony, even if there is an eruv, because the river is a karmelit and their balcony is a reshut hayachid. Again, whoever can see it inside with the diagrams, with the notes, will help understand this Mishnah better. Everybody should have an Erev Shabbat Shalom. Baruch Adonai Le'olam. Amen v'amen.